From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I am Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, and of course the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, who is on the road promoting his new book. David, I think we officially come to the point where Ralph has written more books than I have actually read in my life. The book is called Return to Sender, which is published by Seven Stories Press. David, tell us what the Nation said about the book.
The Nation magazine says of Ralph Nader's unanswered letters to the president, his critiques of U.S. policy are sharp, impassioned, and true to democratic principles, if only Bush and Obama had bothered to listen.
So, Ralph, you were at Barnes & Noble last night with your first book signing in New York City in Union Square. How did that go?
Well, it was a full house, and these were activists. Let's face it. They're very concerned about the direction the country's going into, the political surrender to Wall Street, the suppression of known solutions that have been on the shelf for years, whether it's energy, healthcare, housing, transportation, waging peace, efficient government, proper allocation of public budgets, repairing America. You know, the awareness level and the public opinion polls of the American people are way ahead of what the politicians are holding us back on. And that is a source of optimism. So you don't really have to convince the American people that we've got to get a higher minimum wage, that we need full Medicare for all, free choice of doctor and hospital, everybody in, nobody out, much more efficient. You don't have to convince them that there's corruption and waste in federal budgets, the grotesque tax system. But before we get into this book of letters, there are over 100 letters, about 50-50 to George W. Bush that I wrote and to Barack Obama. Let me ask you, Steve and David, have you ever written a letter to the President of the United States?
I have not.
I did.
What was your letter about, David?
I wrote a letter to President Johnson as a kid, and I got a response. I don't remember what it was about, though. But I did get a response. I still have the engraved stationery.
He signed, you mean?
I think it might have been robo-signed.
Right. So it was a form response, but it was his signature, right?
Yeah, but it was like a fake signature.
Okay. Well, the situation is only worse. The White House does respond to invitations like, will you come to my daughter's high school graduation? They feel that they've got to send courtesy regrets on those. They respond to their partisans and donors. They respond to certain letters that they want to use as political props. And they respond to high-profile issues like the GM bailout that dragged on for some months. So they had a form letter, and that's one of the few letters I got back when I thought that it would be good to write President Obama and say, why don't consumers have a seat at the table when you're considering bailing out Chrysler and GM? I got a form letter back, but over 100 letters, 98% of them were not even acknowledged, never mind replied to. Now, I don't expect the president to read every letter. I do expect every letter to be acknowledged as a courtesy. They don't have to pay postage. They have effectively the franking privilege, as it's called. And I expect that some of the White House staff or the far-flung executive agencies or departments would have responded, because these letters represent the only media people have that is uncensored and unfiltered to directly convey their proposals, their ideas, their descriptions of things that are happening back home that they think the president should know about but doesn't, is the letter from the citizen to his or her president. And that door is closing down when it comes to individual letters that require, say, the Department of Energy or the Auto Safety Agency or the Food and Drug Administration or Department of Defense to respond to. The White House doesn't even bother. I'll give you an example. In the letter, we tried for 4 years to get a meeting between the experienced anti-nuclear power groups in Washington and Secretary of Energy Chu, who is a big booster of nuclear power. And he kept stonewalling us, and he gave every excuse, but we gave him every amount of lead time. So I finally wrote President Obama, and I said, do you know what your Secretary of Energy is doing? He's meeting regularly with pro-nuclear industry lobbyists and trade associations, speaking to them. But he's not even having one meeting with all these groups who've been right on the lack of necessity for nuclear power, its uninsurability, its inability to get financed without government taxpayer guarantees, its non-insurability is a big one here. So I thought, the letter would go to the White House. Volunteers open these letters. They have tables of volunteers historically open these letters to the president, and they categorize them. And I thought, that letter would go to Secretary Chu with maybe a note from the White House staff saying, this is not proper, it's not wise. You need to hear what these groups have to say. Never heard a response, not a single response. So there are two letters in the book, one to President Bush and one to President Obama, which say, what is your policy in answering letters? What's your White House correspondence policy? And I didn't get an answer from either president.
I think you got your answer, Ralph.
Yeah, good point.
Let me ask you this. With so much non-response, why do you continue to write? I guess that's more directed at, the general public hears that. If they're not responding to Ralph Nader, how are they going to respond to me?
Well, that's one point I wanted to make. Another point I wanted to make is when I sent the letter, and I used to fax them, email them, and send them by postal mail. Now the White House has closed down the fax machine, so all you can do is send them by email, and they have a 2,500 character limit for any email letters to the president. So if you send it by mail, and there's no limit, of course, it takes a long time. It's got to go through some detour and be x-rayed and all the rest of it. So increasingly the president is in a bubble, part of it a bubble of his own making. President Obama has made a big deal out of saying that every evening he reads 10 letters from people or kids around the country because he wants to get out of the bubble. Well, the way to get out of the bubble is to instruct your staff and your agencies to answer letters of substance. And they don't do that. Same is true for agencies and departments. Same is true for members of Congress who used to, in the old days, pride themselves on answering every single letter. No matter how ridiculous, they would acknowledge it. Well, my experience is that in the last 10, 15 years, they don't acknowledge any letters other than I lost my VA check or my Social Security check, can you help me? Or from a donor, special categories like that. We can't even get answers to letters from our allies, progressive senators, like Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, Senator Brown, senators that are on the same side we are. Senator Markey, very unresponsive, for instance. So let's generalize a bit here. This is a media. Writing letters to your elected officials is a media. It's a popular media. It is the only media that is uncensored and unfiltered and can express the hearts and minds and knowledge of the American people. And what do? They close it down. They don't even acknowledge it, which is why I called this book Return to Sender.
That's what we're talking about. We're talking about Ralph's latest book, Return to the Sender, from Seven Stories Press. Ralph, is this different than the old days? Let's talk about your lifetime. Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan. Were they better?
They were better. I would get responses regularly from the Carter White House.
Who was the first president you wrote to?
First president I wrote to was President Truman. And I don't recall whether I got a letter. I was a youngster then.
What did you write to him about? Do you remember?
I think I wrote to him about foreign aid. He was starting foreign aid to these countries in Europe,
World War II.
The Marshall Plan and all that. But I really increased the number with Bush and Obama because there were very few outlets. In the 1960s and 70s, I would write a letter to the powerful chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, Senator Warren Magnuson, and it would be news. I would ask for a hearing, for example, on some corporate abuse, and the New York Times or the Washington Post would write it up. And because the politicians knew that the letters would get media coverage, they paid attention to them. Well, now the media doesn't cover them. They could care less. Letters are seen basically as very dispensable, no matter how much content. Dr. Sidney Wolf, who heads our Public Citizen Health Research Group, still will write a very detailed, scientifically loaded letter to the Food and Drug Administration on a hazardous medical device or a hazardous pharmaceutical, and that sometimes will still get media because it's almost like a press release. But by and large, they just ignore it. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. It doesn't involve me. Mark Green, in 2012, during the election period, I think it was like May or June, before the November elections, presidential and congressional, he got 15 or so notable veterans of the Democratic Party to sign a letter. He signed it. Former Mayor Dinkins of New York signed it. Former presidential candidate and Senator Gary Hart signed it. And they sent it to Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, and Harry Reid, who is the head of the U.S. Senate, both Democrats. And the letter, in effect, said, look, you are not promoting old-line democratic reforms. You should be pushing strongly higher minimum wage. You should be pushing for campaign finance reform. And they gave them a whole agenda of issues that, if the Democrats ran with, would not only be good for the American people, but it would be good to get votes. Well, can you believe this? This is like 15 seasoned, well-known Democrats, most of them in retirement, who were leaders, who were legislators and mayors and other office holders. Mm-hmm. Pelosi and Reid never bothered acknowledging the letter. Never mind not replying to it. Didn't even bother acknowledging it. It made a little press, but, you know, if they had acknowledged it, they would have committed themselves to some or all of these issues. They would have gotten more votes. They would have sent the instructions on how to campaign to the various members. Instead, what happened? They lost Senate seats to the Republicans, setting up for the Republican control of the Senate in last November's election. And they lost even more seats to Speaker Boehner in the House of Representatives.
What you do is you write these letters. They are unanswered, but then you shame our leaders by publishing the letters in your columns or in a book. For ordinary citizens, what can they do in terms of writing letters? Because writing letters, I think, is still important. So what advice would you have to citizens? Who should they be writing the letters to, and who should they be CCing on them?
Well, that's key. The CC is key, the bottom of the letter. I mean, if they're writing the president, they should also CC their senators and representative. And if their experience is that the president and the staff and his executive branch is not responsive on prior letters, they can ask the senators and representatives. It's an easy call for them to urge some reply by the president, at least on some issues. It would be an easy call. The other thing is to make it public. It's to put CC, the local newspaper, the local talk show, maybe some political opponents. Beyond that, there's not much that can be done. But if enough people do that, the White House will start saying, we need a policy on how to answer correspondence. And it's got to be more rigorous and not manipulative, just looking for prop letters that we can mention. That might have a good effect. Let me give you an example. Our neighbor to the north is Canada, and I've on occasion written to the Canadian prime ministers. And they all the time acknowledge it on official stationery by the chief in charge of correspondence. It's a very polite response. They identify the letter. They say that they've taken the issues into consideration and are referring the letter to the appropriate ministry of government. Now, you know, one thing you know is that the prime minister's office got the letter. You don't know that when you write to the White House substantive letters. They don't acknowledge. The second thing you know is that someone read it in the prime minister's office in order to write an acknowledgement, and that maybe somebody will read it in the ministry. Now, this letter that I sent, the latest one, to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who's a right-wing warmonger Conservative Party chief and is trying to fray the social safety net of Canada, it was a very critical letter. He still acknowledged it on very impressive letterhead by the chief of correspondence. And our president can't be bothered. His staff can't be bothered. The executive branch and agencies can't be bothered. So what happens here? In this book, Return to Sender, I put myself on the line, in effect. It's not particularly impressive to admit that the government that's supposed to represent you, the White House that's supposed to represent you, supposed to empower you, supposed to give you voice, is shutting you down. I mean, most people don't want to publicize that, right? But you got to do it. That's the first step.
Letter writing is a muscle, and I have found with corporate America, they ask me to put it in writing, and I see it as a form of stonewalling. I always get offended when I'm dealing with corporate America. They say, can you put this in writing, please? And I blow up and I say, now I have to work. I have to sit down and organize my thoughts and create a structure and come across as convincing.
That's the wrong attitude, because you want to have them put their response in writing. Try complaining to the telephone company and get anything in writing back. They want to do it orally. They don't want to do it in writing. So if you do it in writing, David, that gives you greater credibility to ask for an answer in writing. The reason why they don't want to put it in writing is they don't want to be held accountable.
But they want me to put it in writing.
That's all right.
And we live in a post-literate society, and I wonder if you have any tips to our listeners on how you organize your thoughts. How do you structure a letter?
This is what this book is about. Let me give you some teasers here. In this book, you will learn how I exposed George W. Bush's hypocrisy of praising American soldiers in Iraq, yet letting them be exposed to preventable death and injury by not supplying them with available protective equipment and by allowing corporate vendors to sell them contaminated water and food. You will know in this book, Return to Sender, how I exposed the Book Cheney lowballing of U.S. casualties in Iraq, not just the immensely larger Iraqi casualties. You will learn in this book how Bush and Obama's claim that safety is their highest priority in office is belied by their neglect or sabotage of many life-saving programs for the American people, like preventing medical malpractice, occupational disease, hospital-induced infections. 200 Americans a day die from hospital-induced infections, according to the Center for Disease Control. Just let that sink in for a moment. 200 Americans every day die from preventable hospital-induced disease, largely antibiotic resistance by mutating bacteria, because the medical profession has vastly overprescribed to the American people antibiotics when they weren't even indicated medically to be prescribed. And frustration, by the way, Steve, David, is a great source of creativity. I wrote a letter on that to President Obama. I figured, I couldn't get through to him signing the letter, but maybe a special kind of E. coli bacteria might get through to him. And so on page 234, if you want to turn to it, Dave and Steve, is the letter from E. coli 0104 H4.
E. coli stands for Edward coli.
And it says, Dear President Obama, this was June 3, 2011. Dear President Obama, my name is E. coli 0104 H4. I am being detained in a German laboratory in Bavaria, charged with being a highly virulent strain of bacteria. Together with many others like me, the police have accused me of causing about 20 deaths and nearly 500 cases of kidney failure. So far, massive publicity and panic all around. You can't see me, but your scientists can. They are examining me, and I know my days are numbered. I hear them calling me a biological terrorist, an unusual combination of two different E. coli bacterial cells. One even referred to me as a conspiracy of mutants. It's not my fault. I want you to know I cannot help but harm innocent humans, and I'm very sad about this. I want to redeem myself, so I'm sending you this life-saving message straight from my petri dish to you, end quote. And then the rest of the letter basically says, look, you got a war against terrorism? Let me tell you what the real terrorists are, viruses and bacteria, and you're not spending enough time and money in your government to deal with them. Then I ended this way, quote, you, meaning President Obama, are hung up on certain kinds of preventable violence without any risk-benefit analysis. This, you should agree, is utterly irrational. You should not care where the preventable violence comes from, except to focus on its range of devastation and its susceptibility to prevention or cure. Well, here they come to my petri dish for some waterboarding. One last item. You may wonder how tiny bacterial me, probably not even harboring a virus, can send you such a letter. My oozing sense is I'm just a carrier being used by oodles of scientists taking advantage of a high-profile infectious outbreak in Europe to catch your attention. Whatever the how, does it really matter to the need to act now? And I sign off, ecologically yours, E. coli O104H4, for the time being. No answer. No sense of humor, David, Steve. I sent it to the Centers for Disease Control, and they were tremendously happy with it. They sent it all over the place. They need a larger budget to save thousands of American lives.
That's interesting. I have a own personal anecdote about a letter that I wrote when I was in college, and it's kind of similar to what I took a satirical approach. I was on the football team, and there was an article in the paper about vandalism. And in the article, it had nothing to do with the football team, but there was a picture with a caption that said 15 parking meters were pulled out of the ground on the night of the football banquet, which was, somehow suggesting that football players did that with no evidence. So my friend and I were on the football team. We got all up in arms about it. And we both wrote letters. And he wrote a letter like, I am highly offended by the implication that, this and that. And I wrote, don't blame the rest of the team. I'm the one who did it. I did all of them. I hide all of the parking meters under my bed, and my roommate's upset because you got to put a quarter in every time he wants to go to his bunk. And guess which letter the paper printed? They printed mine. They didn't print his.
So humor is powerful.
Humor is powerful.
Yes, it is. And there's a happy semi-ending to this E. coli letter, because about 2 weeks ago, President Obama announced a $1.2 billion program to do something about overuse of antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. So, who knows? It might have helped make that happen. And
well, you wrote that letter in 2011, and that was not part of the discussion at the time. I think people got spooked by Ebola. Does President Obama get any credit for the way this country handled the Ebola outbreak?
Oh, yes, I think he does. And I think the credit primarily goes to the specialists at the Centers for Disease Control and National Institutes of Health, and the people that we sent over there to show that you could stop what was considered a fast-spreading epidemic, deadly, where 80% infected would die, by hydrating people right away. It was the poor villages in the interior in these West African countries where they didn't have adequate water or adequate clean water that led to the rapid expansion. But once they were hydrated with water and quarantined, then what we now look back on is a miracle. The epidemic was contained. Here's another one in the book. This would interest people. After Katrina, there were 10,000 FEMA-purchased new trailers for the homeless in the whole Gulf area. And these were all placed in a town called Hope, Arkansas, which happened to be Bill Clinton's hometown. And they just stood there and started to sink in the mud month after month after month. You could hardly take an aerial picture of them. There were so many of them, and still make out that they were trailers. But anyway, I read a story in the New York Times about it, and I wrote Bill Clinton in New York. And I said, Dear Mr. Clinton, this is your hometown. If there's anything you can do about something like this should be it. So he writes me back, actually, and he said, I've been worried about the same thing. I've contacted the congressman from that district, and I just am frustrated. I can't get anything done. And those trailers should be put to work. They should be given to the homeless all over the Gulf area. And then he writes by hand. He said, why don't you get President Bush to do something about this? After all, he owes you. Can you imagine this? I mean, here's a sharp guy, and he thinks I'm responsible for the Electoral College beating Al Gore, who got 500,000 more votes than George Bush did. I'm responsible for the 250,000 Democrats in Florida who voted for George W. Bush in 2000. I'm responsible for the shenanigans and the crimes of the politicians in Florida, misusing electoral laws and miscounting, the Supreme Court decision, the loss of Tennessee by Gore. I mean, can you imagine?
He's giving you a little backhand, he gets this official response, which is very responsible.
Yeah.
But in his personal thing, he's a little upset. He's giving you a little backhanded slap there.
Yeah. The book is full of things like that. For example, President Obama was president of the Harvard Law Review when he was at Harvard Law School. And so we figured, well, we got a president who, like George W. Bush, thinks that the presidential office has very few constitutional and other restraints on war and drones and special forces and blowing apart sovereignties and killing people overseas and, oh, so sorry wedding party. Oh, so sorry 12 little preteen boys on a hillside collecting wood for the family, blow them apart. Oh, it was a mistake, the drone. So I thought it would be a good idea to contact the Harvard Law Review in Cambridge and suggest that the editors have a symposium with their president in Washington, for his convenience, on the limits on presidential power. Does the president have the power to take the country to war? Absolutely not. That is exclusively reserved under the Constitution to the Congress. Well, the head of the Harvard Law Review, probably wondering what his future prospects would be like, didn't even bother answering. So we sent him a letter. I signed it. Bruce Fine, a Republican peace advocate, signed it. And Congressman Walter Jones signed it. Mm-hmm. And he never bothered responding. So a reporter called the law student who's the president of the Harvard Law Review, and he gave him a no comment. And the successor, a few months later, she said, well, they didn't have the time and the resources. We said we could get foundation resources for the expenses, bringing the editors down to Washington or whatever. No, they didn't want to do it. So that's how bad things are. The legal profession does not come off well. There are letters in this book, Return to Sender, that reflect what's on people's minds everywhere, all over the country, whether they're the behavior of politicians, the rapacious nature of Wall Street and big corporations, consumer safety issues, healthcare issues, issues relating to the responsiveness of government, the grotesque tax system, the wars of aggression, the treatment of veterans. There's even a letter that deals with the question how President Obama's teenage basketball nickname proved to be prescient. Do you know what his nickname was by his co-players in Hawaii?
I'm cheating because I've read the book. Do you want me to say?
Yeah.
Barry Obama.
That's it. He was called Barry Obama on the basketball court.
He shoots a lot.
Yeah, he certainly proved the nickname as president. He actually put more drones overseas, attacked more overseas, led by Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, toppled the regime in Libya, leading to the chaos and killings and sectarian war in Libya, then the spread of Libyan arms into Central Africa and the rest of the Middle East, and destabilizing Mali and other countries, all without declaring war, all without asking Congress for appropriations for the war. One of the most extreme demonstrations of presidential outlawry in American history. And by the way, that's Hillary's war. She even overrode, she pushed aside Secretary Gates. Secretary of Defense Gates didn't want to do this, thought it was going to be a quagmire. He was right.
And he's a
but
Republican.
She prevailed with the White House.
Yeah.
He was a Bush
We're
guy.
talking to Ralph about his new book, Return to Sender, which is available via Seven Stories Press. And Ralph was on the phone because he's on the road promoting it. He was at Barnes & Noble in Union Square in New York City last night. Ralph, David and I, before the show, were talking, going through the book, and we were talking about one particular letter that you wrote to President Bush on July 7, 2004. And we've talked about this on the show. But in the letter, the title of the letter is, Will You Pledge to Not Reinstate the Draft? Now, we've talked about your views on the draft, and you had mentioned this as being one of the things that you regret promoting in the 70s, which is the abolishment of the draft. Tell us about this letter. How does that square with your views now?
Well, I think I made a mistake. I didn't want the draft. I saw what it did in the Vietnam War. I saw the draft as giving the government a huge reserve of soldier power, which would encourage them to be more aggressive overseas. But then when they ended the draft, and Nixon was smart, when he ended the draft, he deflated all the anti-war protests on campuses all over the country, university, college campuses. We turned to a volunteer army. A volunteer army took its ranks from a very tiny slice of American families. And when the next wave of aggression overseas by the U.S. commenced, guess what? We had most of the American people couldn't care less. They had no stake. They weren't part of the risk. They weren't fearful of their children being drafted. And therefore, we developed a flattery prospect where we flattered the existing volunteer soldiers everywhere they were, and they became a sort of elite. And the rest of the country began to be in awe of this volunteer army. When you're part of the army, when you go in for basic training, when you're drafted, you're no longer in awe, believe me, of the armed forces, because you've been there. They're not, pure, and they're not totally valiant, and, they harass women, and they waste a lot of material, and they beat each other up, and blood and gore of war is just what it is. Can't glorify it. Well, what happened is that there was no constituency out there against the war, because 95% of the American people never felt it. They weren't tasked for it. Both Bush and Obama passed the bill of the wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan to the children of America. They put it on a credit card. They financed it through debt and deficit. So now I'm rethinking. If we have the reinstitution of the draft, and of course there's far more people for any soldiers that are needed, there would be also an associated 2 years of public service, which a lot of Republicans and Democrats in the past have supported. So like a much broader VISTA program.
But I think Steve and I were proud that we thought we caught you.
Yeah, I was caught by the future that it developed. I was still analyzing it from the point of view of the Vietnam War and how unfair the draft was. As you know, if you could get a lawyer and you went to Harvard, you could pretty much avoid the draft. It was a business by lawyers. So lower income people still were less likely to be able to avoid the draft. That was another reason why a lot of us disliked the draft intensely. In the 3 months up to the invasion of Iraq by Bush and Cheney, unconstitutional criminal invasion based on lies and deceptions that have now become accepted as lies and deceptions in the course of history, I sent a letter with my colleague John Richard and Robert Weissman to George W. Bush's mother, father, and wife in a desperate last-minute appeal to curtail their bad boy. And the letter was stimulated by prior letters by religious groups, women's peace groups, student groups, business groups, labor groups, retired intelligence officials groups, and so on, each of whom had many members around the country, totaling millions of members. They begged to have an audience with President George W. Bush to tell him of their concerns about invading Iraq. Some of them had been in Iraq and collected very important information that belied Bush and Cheney's propaganda, and he never bothered even acknowledging them. Even a veterans group, a business group, retired intelligence officials, the National Council of Churches. This letter was delivered on March 19th, 2003.
Just before the invasion?
Just before the invasion. And it recalls Senator Robert Byrd, who sat on the floor of the Senate in opposing the pending invasion of Iraq. He said on March 7th on the floor of the Senate, Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia, Democrat, he said, quote, referring to George W. Bush, quote, "He talked last night like a man who's not willing to listen any further. He has stopped listening," end quote. We wrote this letter, never acknowledged, never answered, of course. The rest is disastrous history. 1 million Iraqis or more dead, millions of refugees, the country blown apart, sectarian violence, spilling over the borders, 5,000 U.S. soldiers killed, 100,000 injured, traumatized or sickened, families disrupted in the U.S., trillions expended, and what we get? The metastasizing of the Al-Qaeda into country after country. What's interesting here is that none of these letters by all these groups with millions of members back home were ever reported on in the media. Not even the progressive media. They were all released to the press. That is what I'm trying to point out in this book, Return to Sender. When you degrade and exclude and suppress and black out the only communication system that the people in this country have that's unfiltered, uncensored, and can be initiated and preserved by the American people, the letters to their public elected officials, you're going to have a country in trouble.
Other countries knew. I was going to ask you how certain you were back then that this invasion was wrong. The UN got it right. The UN inspectors, even before the war, were telling us there were no weapons of mass destruction.
That's right. They were destroyed after the first Gulf War under Western surveillance and under Western pressure. Anything that Saddam Hussein had in terms of preliminary chemical, biological, nuclear was destroyed. In fact, that's why he couldn't believe that the U.S. was going to invade, because he would always keep it a little ambiguous about whether he had a nuclear program, just to ward off his Middle East enemies. And he couldn't believe it right to the end. He couldn't believe that the U.S. was going to invade because he thought the U.S. knew exactly what he knew after the first Gulf War.
So with Iran and the framework, a lot of conservatives are saying, you want to leave it up to the UN to tell us whether or not Iran is enriching the uranium. The UN does a pretty good job inspecting.
I should say the International Atomic Energy Authority out of Vienna is the inspection corps, and they have made 7,000 inspections of Iran. No inspections of Israel's 200 to 400 nuclear weapons, because Israel doesn't belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that almost every country in the world belongs to. And when you don't belong, and the only other country of any significance that doesn't belong is North Korea and Israel, they don't have to accept inspectors. But you asked how sure we were that the invasion was going to be a disaster. We were quite sure. We had people coming back from Iraq. We knew that they were going to blow Iraq apart. I mean, when you had all those tanks, all those planes, all those Navy ships in the Gulf, right on the border in Kuwait and Iraq, this was overwhelming force. You remember, they were reverberating off General Colin Powell's principle, which is once you invade a country, you own it. And once you invade a country, do it with overwhelming force. Well, they used overwhelming force. They toppled Saddam in a matter of days. They disbanded the army. The soldiers who were disbanded in Saddam's army are now prominent in ISIS and other al-Qaeda offshoots. And the other principle of Colin Powell was not adhered to. Namely, we invaded Iraq, we blew it apart, but we didn't own it. What he meant when he said we own it is under international law, when you invade a country, you are responsible for the safety of all the citizens, of all the civil society. You don't blow up the waterworks and the electricity, and you don't police the streets, and you don't starve people. You are responsible for their protection. We didn't own it. We blew it apart. And now Iraq and its aftermath is blowing that whole area apart, and anybody who thinks it's not coming to the U.S. is dreaming.
You write to President Bush right before he leaves office and ask him to square the numbers of soldiers who were actually injured from that invasion. We were never given the right numbers?
That's right. The official number of soldiers injured in Iraq is now slightly less than 40,000, which is absurd. The definition is if they are injured in actual combat, not going to skirmishes, not coming from skirmishes, not having accidents in the theater of war or some explosive on their side blowing up. So the number is actually more than triple that. It's well over 100,000 injuries. And it's interesting that 60 Minutes did an expose on this some years ago. And they interviewed 3 soldiers who were severely wounded in Iraq, but not in actual fighting. And they were pretty resentful that they were not officially counted in the official casualty toll. Now, it's one thing to illegally invade a country, one thing to kill all numbers of citizens there, another thing to spend trillions of dollars doing it. It's another thing not to pay for it now and to pass the bill on to our children and grandchildren and higher deficits. But Bush and Cheney didn't even have the decency to tell the families back home that the casualties occurred in Iraq at the number they did, because they didn't want to arouse the people. You see, there was a political utility to it. They didn't want to alarm the people. So they actually lowballed the injuries. They couldn't lowball the fatalities that were shipped to Dover, Air Force Base in Delaware, but they kept the families from meeting their loved ones at Dover until Obama reversed that Bush policy, to his credit.
You also, that same letter, you talk about the how President Bush loves being commander-in-chief and can't wait to speak to soldiers, but he never spoke to the United States Institute of Peace. And when I read that, I said, what the hell is the United States Institute of Peace?
It's a government-funded institute to advance peace, to have conferences on peace. It's a tiny, tiny budget compared to the military budget.
When was it set?
It was set up probably 30, 40 years ago. Could have been set up under Carter. And it has a building in Washington, and they do have conferences. Most people don't realize that we signed on to a treaty in the 1920s called the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which outlawed war. It made any war an illegal act. And, not national defense, but any war. It outlawed war, and we still belong to that treaty. So the Institute of Peace illustrates something that we'll spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year to prepare for war or wage war, but we won't spend $100 million to wage peace and get arms control treaties and educate the public.
There seems to be a central hypocrisy that I hear from people who supported the war in Iraq and support making war in Iran now, bringing it into the present tense. And the excuse for the war in Iraq was, all these other countries thought they had weapons of mass destruction too. But when you tell them about the Iran negotiations, and it's not just between us and Iran, it's between us and 5 or 6 other countries, they don't seem to take into consideration the fact that all these other countries think these negotiations are worthwhile.
Yeah, countries, real small countries like China, Russia, England, France. That's the coalition that we're part of in negotiating with Iraq. The problem is that memories are short. The people who abhor war the most are the people who were in wars in World War II. I belong to a group called Veterans for Peace. They are veterans from World War II, from Korean War, from Vietnam War. You want to talk about advocates of peace, you talk to those veterans. They know that there's no glory in war. They know the brutality of it, the futility of it. They know when we shouldn't have gone to war, that we should have waged peace and prevented perceived conflicts. In the book, by the way, I do have some lighter moments. I wrote a letter to Michelle Obama to support her standing her ground against the fast food lobbyists that were literally trying to undermine her efforts to improve the diets for children. She's made a mission out of trying to get more nutritious foods into school cafeterias, into the school lunch program, into vending machines. And the fast food companies didn't like that. Their junk food was being gradually displaced, and they tried to muscle her. So I wrote a letter to her supporting her. I wrote a letter to President Obama on a 2-track presidential plan. I think presidents have 2 tracks to pursue. One is what presidents usually do that we read about, and the other is to give people power, make it easier for them to organize as consumers, as workers, as taxpayers, We have very concrete ways that this can be done without any spending of tax dollars, just giving people easy ways to pursue their particular sense of injustice or justice, and no answer on that one. I sent the same letter to President Carter. In a meeting with President Carter, he indicated he had read it and he appreciated it. So things are getting worse. We've got to open up the White House to the people's media. What's the people's media? The letters that they are sending. And the more and more they don't get acknowledged, the fewer and fewer letters the people will be sending to their president.
You wrote a letter in 2009 to President-elect Obama about the erosion of civil liberties under the Bush administration. You know, you talk about his use of drones overseas. Are our civil liberties more intact now under his administration than they were? Did he listen?
Well, he's doing far less torture than Bush, although a lot of stuff going on in Guantanamo is almost daily mistreatment, almost by definition of their location and where they are. Under the Obama administration, the machinery is in place to round up people, throw them in jail without charges on suspicion of terrorism or supporting terrorism, and or even being a material witness to something, and make it hard for them to get lawyers. That's the Patriot Act. They can still search your home and not tell you for 72 hours under the Patriot Act, so-called. They can get your library records, your medical records, your financial records on flimsy pretexts. The courts are not playing the independent arm's length role that they are designed to play in such instances. After all, illegal search and seizure of your records or your homes or your businesses is a federal felony. It has a penalty of 5 years in jail. And both Bush and Cheney clearly were felonious, because now the records have all come out, NSA, the Snowden revelations, and so on, that they did to thousands of Americans engage in illegal search and seizure. And there's no statute of limitation on that kind of crime. A Justice Department can still go after Bush and Cheney. So what's the scene here? The scene, if we ever have 2 or 3 major terrorist attacks on the U.S. on the scale of 9/11, get ready for police state. Security will triumph and trump completely civil liberties and freedoms.
That's the scariest thing you've ever said on this show.
And it's about as certain a prediction as you can make in American politics. First, based on the experience after 9/11. Second, on how panicked the country gets and how panicked the Congress gets and how willingly they are to give all the power to the president.
In the 70s, the Weather Underground was blowing up buildings about once a week, and occasionally there was collateral damage. People were dying. We didn't have a Department of Homeland Security back then. Why were we more willing back then to live with a certain level of terrorism?
Well, first of all, it was quite minimal compared to, obviously, the casualties of 9/11. But more important is 9/11 came from foreign territory. And what you're talking about with the Weathermen were domestic alienated youth who were Americans. But there was suppression. There was definitely suppression of speech. There was spying on colleges. The Army was caught spying on civilian activities. The FBI was out of control. We do not have a strong democracy that can preserve freedom in the midst of security challenges. That goes all the way back to what Ben Franklin said when he said, any society that preserves security over freedom deserves neither. So you can see that tension goes back centuries between security and freedom. And when we're not being attacked is when we should be bolstering our defenses of our freedoms. Because, I mean, what's the point of security if you don't have any freedom? When fear, anxiety, you can't speak out, you're looking over your shoulder, you don't know who's snooping on your most personal lives.
I remember what Attorney General John Mitchell said. People who have nothing to hide shouldn't be afraid of the government snooping into their private affairs. And then he ended up going to jail.
Well, we're talking to Ralph about his new book, Return to Sender. He's been on the road promoting it. It's a compilation of letters over the last 15 or so years that he wrote to George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. And we're going to take a short break right now. We may return to this in future shows. But right now, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to take some more of your listener questions. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up, rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
I said you step up, step up. I think that you should step up, rise up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. If you would like Ralph's weekly column sent to your mailbox, your email box, go to nader.org and sign up for his weekly newsletter and subscribe to the show as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. We take listener questions, and if you have a question for Ralph Nader, like his Facebook page, and that's how you get to ask him questions. We take all our questions from the Facebook page, like this one from Richard Lassen. How can we get the presidential debates to include third-party candidates?
Well, first of all, that is very important to do. And I think what we got to do is convince one or two networks to sponsor debates, and they'll only sponsor them when all the candidates who have qualified for enough ballots on enough states' electoral college to theoretically win the election are on that stage. The debate commission, the Commission on Presidential Debates, is just a private corporation created by the Republican Democratic parties in the late 1980s to get rid of the League of Women Voters, which up to that time had sponsored presidential debates. They thought the League of Women Voters was too uppity and too independent. So then they decided who gets on the debates, how many debates, what reporters are chosen to ask the questions, what corporations can fund the hospitality suites at the debates locations. I mean, it's an absurd situation. We're the laughing stock of the Western world here. Other countries, they put the minority parties on their debates. The only power the Debate Commission has is it gets all the networks on board, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, CNN, to relay the debates. And that's one reason why the debates have anywhere from 40 to 80 million viewers, huge audiences, almost Super Bowl type audiences, although they're diminishing in recent years from their peak of, I think it was 92 million Americans watched the debate. The last time a third-party candidate was on the debate, which was Ross Perot in 1992 with Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Here's my answer to the question. We need to try to get one or two networks. And in order to do that, I think they have to be sued, because the argument is that they are a commercial operation and they are in cahoots with the Debate Commission and its choice of candidates. And they get a lot of visitors to their website and a lot of viewers to these networks that they can sell advertisements to and gain revenue. And I think a lawsuit is being prepared as we speak that may be filed on that theory.
How could we sue not only to get more candidates in the debates, but more reporters? I was watching an old debate sponsored by the League of Women Voters, and they had like 5 actual reporters. Now it's always a showcase for, Brian Williams or
Candy Crowley.
Yeah. I mean, the hubris, they call it Meet the Press, and it's just Chuck Todd. And
that's why nothing ever comes out of these debates. They're just parallel press conferences with 90% of the questions predictable in advance with canned answers that they've been practicing prior to the debate on their campaign trail. It's a fraud on the American people.
The moderator of the debate is just as nervous as the two candidates. You should have people asking questions who have nothing to lose.
That's right. And they have they have a captive audience that they pat on the head and say, don't be unruly, don't shout, don't ask questions. This is supposed to be the world's greatest democracy. Come on, people out there. Try to find one network to say we want to debate with, say, 6 presidential candidates. There won't be more than 6 who will have enough ballot lines on enough states to theoretically qualify for a majority of the electoral votes. So what's 6? I mean, Canada has had 7, 8. Other Western countries have had 10. And by the way, in the 2012 Republican primary, they had over 8 presidential candidates in debate after debate. Remember Newt Gingrich and Bush and all the others? So, so there's plenty of precedent, and we've got to change it, because the only way these smaller candidates can ever reach the American people is through those debates. When I ran in 2000, I filled Madison Square Garden, the Boston Garden, Target Center in Minneapolis, the major arenas, and I only reached about 2% of the number of American voters that I could have reached had I been on just one debate, one presidential debate.
Wow.
But that would be too dangerous, Ralph. We all know that.
And you got to see Ralph Nader live.
That's right. You got to see him live. He does a great drum solo. It's amazing. About a 5-minute drum solo.
Yeah.
Just like Buddy Rich.
I do a soft shoe ballet to get on one of those debates.
That's right. Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on Facebook. We'll work our way through them. And we've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We're going to be back next week. Join us. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, I'm Steve Scrovan. Ralph?
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks, David. Thank your listeners. And tune in next week. We'll have some pretty invigorating interviews and commentary.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Steve's in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple, just make a list of demands. We demand freedom, we demand equality, we demand justice. It ain't gonna happen until folks like you and me just stand up. Well, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, stand up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Well. Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you.